Hi, Jane.
Hello, how are you, Maria?
Oh, doing well. And I guess it's good morning and happy Saturday to you.
Yes, and good afternoon and happy Friday to you.
Thank you. So nice to see you. And thank you so much for taking time to meet with us. And it's always a treat to get to talk to you. And it's been some years since we've even gotten to paint together.
I know, and hopefully, if all being well, we will again next year when I'm there in April. But when is a strange word in these times.
I know, I know. Well, I'm just so grateful that we're able to connect like this. And I'm such a fan, both of you personally as a friend and inspiration, and with your all of your amazing color explorations. I mean, you just created these terrific resources, your book and your website, and your passion for just exploring really shows through and in sharing that work with others. So
As does your passion with making it all portable.
Yeah, I've been following that for some years now. And I just have to give a shout out that you, I feel like, were one of my earlier supporters with the Pocket Palette right after I first came out with it, and really meant a lot to me as you found them as I was just tinkering and starting out and filling them with your paints. And I just always appreciated that. So thank you.
It's been a fun partnership.
Well, we talked that we'd be diving some into triads today, and
Yes.
wondered if we wanted to dive in a little bit on where to start with that. I know color is so seductive to everyone. I mean, I brought here one of my personal charts I've made exploring a bunch of my paints to look at their
Nice.
properties, and I could spend, I feel like color is just seductive. Some colors look good enough to eat practically. But there's a lot of power in limiting our choices and exploring mixing. And I wonder if you might share a little bit for those who are new to the idea of triads, just a little bit about them.
Yeah, sure. One of the things that you need to be thinking about is that you can do a huge amount with very few colors. So I've got some I'm going to show you. Means a bit of flipping around in books, but I've got a couple here to show you what you can do. And the basic triad that I like people to start with, if they've never done anything before, is Ultramarine, which is a lovely warm blue. It'd be very hard to set up a palette without Ultramarine, I think. And Quinacridone Rose, which is also called Permanent Rose in some, and Hansa Yellow Medium.
Yeah.
So it's a really basic triad, and I'm going to just switch over to another view.
And I've just got these colors in front of me too, so I'll mix some swatches of them too as you share them.
Now I'm trying to figure out how I do this. There we go. There we go. So that's Hansa Yellow Medium and Quinacridone Gold. Sorry, not Hansa Yellow Medium, Quinacridone Rose and Ultramarine. And as you can see, it makes beautiful, usable greens, lovely bright reds and oranges, and really bright purples. And the nice thing about it is that it doesn't have any staining colours that can cause issues. Now, just to see what's possible, here we go. This is all using just those three colours. So you can see you can make beautiful orangey yellows, you can make purples, you can make browns, you can make greys. There's almost nothing that you can't make except perhaps a really rich crimson. So it's extraordinary how much you can do with it. And then if you work with just those three colours, you really understand your colour mixing. So when you're mixing away there, you can create a lovely purple, you can get all those greens. And if the greens need to be a little bit more olive, you add a tiny, tiny touch of the rose. And that will dull the colour down. You can just see how it just, only a tiny bit.
Yeah, here we go. That
So
complementary color
you add
coming
more, you'll create the browns. And if you add more again, you'll start to create all the neutrals. So just working with, those three colours, you can create massive, massive range. And it's just beautiful to explore. And none of them are too staining to deal with. So if you need to, you can lift things out. But it does give you an extraordinary range. Now here's a little thing painted with just those colours.
Oh, I love it.
And I think I've got another one too. Wait on, well, that's a different one. I've got so many things in books. This is also done with just those colours.
Now, do you,
As is that.
and just for people who aren't as familiar with some of the staining colors, I'll just point out that like the phthalos are some of your classic staining, where if you put a little bit of it on your paper, such as a phthalo blue up here, it can be hard to lift off the paper. And in this chart that I made, I actually explored the properties of my colors with how staining they were, the different properties, and opaque. So I had the black Sharpie line, and then I had this whiter area, and that's where I painted the stripe over the line. And once things dried, I put some tape over them, and I took a wet brush and dabbed with paper towel and even a sponge and really tried to get some of the pigment off. And you can see what Jane was talking about with like that Hansa yellow medium. It's easier to remove compared down here to a phthalo blue, and you can see how hard those were to take off. And
yeah, that's right. And it's a very worthwhile one to do, because where it comes into play, I'm running an online course at the moment, and someone said, why does it matter? And there are a couple of principles that are worth keeping in mind. For example, the colours that are the most staining tend to be the finer particles. And if you think about it, because they're so fine, they creep down into the paper. And so they are much harder to then remove. Whereas the colours that tend to be the larger particles will tend to sit more on the surface, and so they tend to be easier to remove. But where it's useful is if you want to build up lots and lots of layers, then you want to use the most transparent colours, and you want to tend to use more staining colours so that you don't accidentally lift anything up as you're putting other layers down. Whereas the thicker or more opaque colours, you really don't want to be doing a series of glazes. So understanding the properties of your colours is really important. Also, if you were doing studies like leaves and botanicals, if you use a liftable or non-staining colour, you're then able to lift out the veins much more easily than having to paint around every single vein that you're trying to do. So lifting pigments can be very helpful.
I completely agree. And that idea of starting to know your paints. And something else I really enjoy about the Triad, or even just a limited palette where maybe I'll be painting with 4, maximum 5 colors in a painting, is everything, all the colors hold hands, because your neutrals are mixed from those 3 primaries. Your greens are relate to the sky. And that's one of the really beautiful things I see about that basic. And I'm just exploring, as we're talking, some of the neutrals that I can mix from just those 3 you mentioned.
Yeah. Many of them. And generally speaking, the easiest way to make really nice browns and grains is to start by making an orange and gradually add the blue. It seems an easier way than to start with a purple or start with a green. So if you just try making that beautiful bright orange that you can make with the Hansa yellow and the Quinacridone rose, and then gradually add the blue, get a really mid-orange first.
Yeah, here we go.
Then gradually add the blue, just a tiny bit, and it'll start to go into a burnt, Quinacridone burnt orange colour. Add a bit more and you create a burnt sienna. Add a bit more and it creates a burnt umber. Add a bit more, it creates a grey. So you can see how you can create all those neutrals, and it really helps to understand them. But the really important thing is, and this is something I'm always teaching with my students, is since you can create the colours, you can also add them. So if you can create a burnt sienna, then you can add it. And burnt sienna would be the 4th colour that I would add. You can create yellow ochre or a raw sienna. So if you want to, you can add it. So the idea of a limited palette doesn't mean that you're only ever allowed to use 3 paints for the rest of your life. But it does mean that if you can create the colours with that triad, then you can add any other colours that are convenience to help you to paint with them.
I love that, because so many people have questions of how to start to expand their palette. And as you get to know your mixes, then you can add in some of these convenient sort of shortcut colors, which will make sketching more quick. You can sketch more quickly too, because sienna and like that ultramarine is one of my favorite go-tos. And
well, mine too, as you know.
and isn't that Jane's gray? Remind me, is that burnt sienna and ultramarine?
Ultramarine, that's right.
Which, if you need a fantastic shortcut color, Daniel Smith put together Jane's favorite mix for Jane's gray, which is has a spot in my palette.
Oh, and all of mine. Funny that.
And then you can tweak it too. So for example, one of my favorite colors that granulates is a sienna, but it's lunar earth. So it gets this really wonderful texture. And then when I want to gray that out for rocks, I'll add in often that same ultramarine, but then I'll get some cool textures.
And that's the thing. So watercolor is not just about the color. Because it's the purest way of working with pigment, it's also about the characteristics. And so this is one of the reasons that we end up developing a larger palette of colors. You can work with just 3 or 4 or 5, but then you might want a granulating blue, for example. Or yes, exactly. So I end up with a palette when I'm sketching of usually about 24. But I don't put them all in one painting, and I'll only use the colours that are going to harmonise with the basic triad that I'm working with. And so it's a very different way of thinking. You start with your triad, you think, okay, which yellow is going to do most of what I need? Which red will do most of what I need? Which blue will do most of what I need? And sometimes you need to use 2 yellows or 2 reds or 2 blues. And then you can add your earth colours as well, and you can add the appropriate convenient mixes. For example, of the chart that you've just done, you could not happily add phthalo green. It would just be over the top. Whereas if you'd done the same chart using phthalo blue instead, then you could add phthalo green because you'd be able to make it. And so it's planning out which colours are working.
I think I might actually have one very similar. Let's see here. This one's Hansa Yellow Medium, Phthalo Blue, Red Shade, and Imperial Red. And so I think you probably inspired me to do this some years ago. I did a number of just explorations of some different triads. And I'll mention to everyone too that you have a great page on your website, Jane, going through examples of different triads. And so these 3 were more of like a classic primary. And then I did a real earth toned one.
Yes, well, here's another earth tone.
And this one's like a raw sienna, deep scarlet, which if you know my palette, I'm a big fan. Oh, there we go. Jane's got the, and goethite. That's just a beautiful color, kind of a similar to raw sienna
yes, but just with so much more granulation.
Yeah, and then...
But instead of goethite, you could use yellow ochre, or you could use Montamiata natural sienna, or you could use raw sienna. And they'll all give you different mixes, but I like the goethite. And here's a painting.
Obviously, we need every single one just to play with for any occasion. Oh, lovely.
You can see how, you know, it's only using 3 colours, but you get this wonderful harmony.
Yeah, here's another one with a rhodonite genuine in cerulean blue, where you can really see that some of those earth tones. And so I'll show you something I found helpful in my work that I don't know if you've done, or I recommend people to try if they're experimenting with color, is to paint the same scene multiple times with a triad to really push it. So here's a lighthouse scene, and these were just 3 colors, Quinacridone Gold, Quinacridone Rose, and Indanthrone Blue.
Oh, that's a nice try.
Fun to show yourself the range of what you can do with those just 3, pushing it toward more of a warm palette or cool. But in both of these examples, there's a unity to the whole piece because these green tones involve the whole sky, and that's just, I think, kind of speaking to the whole beauty of the triads that we're talking about.
Yes, I certainly do. So when I'm teaching, we'll go through at least 5 triads usually, whether it's a week-long workshop or an online workshop, and then we do the same picture using all 5 triads so that you really do see exactly that, because it gives a different mood, and it helps you to then work out how to manipulate colours to try and create what you're looking for. Some triads it's easier to get a bright green, but harder to get a dull, and sometimes you can only make a dull green and you have to just live with it. So working with the different triads with the same subject is a really good exercise. And I like those ones, they look great.
Oh, thank you. I know. In fact, I've painted this lighthouse a number of times.
I'm not surprised.
This is done with the brighter triad. So coming back to this more pure primary, and you can see it's got a different sort of mood and brightness from the greens, from that phthalo blue, red shade, Hansa Yellow Medium, and Imperial Red, and compared to that earthier one with the Indanthrone. And I saw a question, if you might hold up your earth tone triad again, Jane. Someone was just wanting to remember. I think that was goethite.
cerulean chromium, and Indian red.
And just a beautiful, beautiful range you get there.
I can show you dozens of triads if you like. So here's the one I showed you before. So that's I just call that a basic primary triad. I'll show you some other favorites. So this one is the earth one, done again.
Mm-hmm.
One that I really love, I call it the Aussie Tribe because it's so suitable for Australian landscape, but it also works really well in Oregon and around your area.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got these earthy, very realistic greens and this wonderful teal colour, quite neutralised purples, and then slightly neutralised oranges, but it actually works really, really well for landscape.
Oh, that's fantastic. So the colours in that, Jane?
The Quinacridone Gold, Ultramarine, and Pyrrole Crimson.
Love that crimson.
So do I. And then another one that I wanted to show you, that's the earth one. Oh, a cool triad. So it's similar to the ultramarine, but instead of ultramarine, it's using phthalo blue. And you can see how it's really, really bright. So there's phthalo green hue. But obviously in this triad, that's what I was talking about, you could add phthalo green because it mixes. You could also add dioxazine violet because you could add it. And if you wanted to, you could add some of your other bright reds and oranges. So just because you're basing it around this triad doesn't mean you're stuck with only 3 paints. Many people have more than that, and they'll all tie in, but you can understand where they tie in, and that's the really important thing for colour harmony.
I love this because it really just touches on that whole building block of finding your palette and starting with those basics to really, those essentials to really understand it, and then expanding out. And everyone sort of finds what resonates more with them. If you gravitate more towards the earth tones or a granulating pigment or more of the pure transparent pigment, you can find that variation. Like there's just so many different types of kind of that yellow ochre tone, from goethite to that, I'm going to see if I can pronounce it correctly, the Monte Amiata.
Monte Amiata, yes, Monte Amiata Natural Sienna.
To yellow ochre, and they've got different properties from their opacity, and obviously a little variation, which might be more appropriate for your landscape or your subject matter.
That's right. So you can choose the properties as well as choosing the colours, and that's the joy of watercolour. Here's one done with that triad. So that's the earth triad. So it's a couple of Australian native leaves, and it's done entirely using the same 3 colours. So that's these guys. Quinacridone Gold, Ultramarine, and Pyrrole Crimson. But it's really watering them down. And this is the thing with watercolour to remember, that when you want the lighter colours, you don't add white, you just add water. So these are very diluted, but there's the colours in here, and then they're diluted through here.
Oh, I love your charts along the top and bottom for those. That is so much fun to see the range there, Jane.
I just have fun. Here's some more. So I'm working on a book that's called Working with Triads, and there are zillions of them. And they don't have to be primary. These are some secondary triads. This is some granulating secondary triads. So we've got a granulating earthy orange, and a granulating earthy green, and a granulating earthy purple. So this is amethyst and green apatite genuine and transparent red oxide. So you can explore triads using so many different things. So, I mean, you kind of get the idea. It's a little bit of a passion. So here's this.
Oh, you've just got a whole book of these, Jane. And you keep them so neat and tidy. I'm so impressed with, do you have like how you keep these so laid out so beautifully?
I make a template.
I'm just going to show everyone for fun that sometimes I explore things neatly, but I think I, as an artist, verge a little bit more towards messy explorations. And so this was exploring a triad. So this is the same triad, the Hansiella medium, Pyrrole red, and phthalo blue red shade. And one I was a little more tight and controlled, and the other I let loose a bit more. And that, you know, it's that idea of kind of learning rules and then letting yourself play and gravitating towards what works for you. And
Absolutely.
so much of the mixing comes from experimenting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you have to
um,
play as well.
so I've got a couple of questions for you, Jane, just because I have to ask. I don't think I've ever asked you this question. Out of all of these colors, do you personally have like a favorite color or your own personal favorite triad or mix?
Mm, well, that's a big question, isn't it? The colours that appear on every palette I've done. I mean, as you know, I've been using Daniel Smith since 1995.
Oh, you
Um,
beat me by
so
a year. I've only been using them since 1996.
so I've explored them all, and the colours that I just struggle not to have are buff titanium, which is a really
Mm-hmm.
strange one because it's a sort of a non-colour to some people, but I really love it. Quinacridone Gold. I have the original Quinacridone Gold, and while the hue is very, very similar, I just love the Quinacridone Gold. Ultramarine is on all my palettes. Goethite I use a huge amount as well. It's once again, it's a slightly unusual colour, but I work with it all the time. So this sort of, if I try and come down to just 5 colours or just 6 colours, I struggle a bit because I've got so many favourites, but they would be Quinacridone Rose, Ultramarine, Quinacridone Gold, Hands Yellow Medium, Buff Titanium, and Jane's Grey and Burnt Sienna. That's kind of the limit of if I have to go really small, I can go down to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm more comfortable having a few more because I'm a realist. And so most of the time I'm really trying to get the exact same colour. But
Mm-hmm.
I also don't want it to take too long. And sometimes having the extra colours just speeds up the mixing. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the fewer colours you have, the more mixing space you need. The more colours you have, to a point, the faster you can actually create something. So there's always a balance. So as long as you understand the colours and how to add colours sensibly, you can then add in other colours for convenience, but still keep colour harmony. But there are so many wonderful Daniel Smith colours and so many wonderful watercolours, full stop, that it's sort of hard to just limit to one or two.
Yeah. Oh,
What's
I
your
agree
favourite?
completely.
You like
Oh.
Quinacridone Coral, don't you? That was one of your favourites.
Quinacridone Coral, a friend of mine introduced that to me. Let's see, I think I've got that on this palette. I'd say but that might be rose. I should double check. I think that's coral. It's a little more pinky than quinacridone rose. I gravitate toward the earth tones.
Oh, yes, so do I.
So with my polar palette, which is in my expeditionary art palette, I sort of do a lot of my big paintings with these 6 colors, and really predominantly it's hand yellow medium, and then I oscillate between raw sienna and yellow ochre depending on the opacity I'm interested in. Yellow ochre has a little more just sediment and opaque, and then deep scarlet, Indian blue, and cerulean blue chromium. And I really love granulation. And I see a shout out to Potter's Pink. Yes, I love Potter's Pink. Oh, and Cascade Green. I mean, as I mentioned, it's like I feel like a kid in the candy store anytime I'm, visiting Daniel Smith and trying out new colors. But that's some of my personal gravitation. Something I love to do when I'm in the field that helps me kind of choose and explore is just play. Like I love to bring a lot of colors. If I'm traveling, I'll often, this is 29 colors. I've got my phalos split. And this way, it's not that I'm doing every painting like you mentioned, Jane, with my whole palette. I'm picking some colors and I'm exploring my palette. And so through my expeditionary art projects, I call it my palette of place, where I'll play with, hey, here's some of the browns I'm seeing. And you can see some of my little shorthand notes, which I try and make legible for the future, to explore my mixes. And then when I'm back in my studio, I really pull this information into, maybe it's more of a cerulean blue or cobalt teal blue that I'll be working with. And that's one of my favorite things to do is play with what I see, and all of our eyes are different in terms of how we kind of interpret and see. So I'm not just using my camera for a reference, but my memory and my sketches and my notes.
Yes, because the cameras and so on change it. The colours that you see on location are so different. And I think it's really important to do that's why I love sketching on location and finishing on location, because then you're actually sketching in the natural light and really exploring it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just seeing a couple people questioning kind of that sort of initial palette to play with. Jane mentioned this first triad, and I'll just leave this note up here, of ultramarine, Hansa yellow medium, and quinacridone rose. And you can see some of my notes with those colors here. And I sell in our shop, I'm a fan of the Daniel Smith Essential Set, which has a little more of a lemony yellow and then an orangey yellow. It's Hansi Yellow Light and New Gamboge, which together you can mix a little more of that medium yellow, and then includes French ultramarine, very similar to ultramarine. And this is a nice range, and kind of, it goes into this, what's called a split primary palette. But I find as a starting point, it pushes you to mix, and then you can add in, I love what you said, once you can mix a sienna, feel free to buy a sienna and
exactly.
buy yourself a shortcut green. You learn how to mix greens, but then if you've got some that just really feel resonate with what you paint with regularly, pull those in.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But getting to know the colours is important. And that's why I've put up so many swatches on my website, so that people can see all the different colours. I can show you the book, so I'll spin you around here. So I started on this many years ago when I started to actually look into the colours and what they do. I'll just create some space. So this is a it's a watercolour book that it's done in a moleskin book, and it goes through. If I don't know what happens if I turn it around, it's going to go weird, isn't it? No, I have to do it that way. So I've gone through every single colour that's in the Daniel Smith range and written out notes and colour mixes and explorations, and it's a way of really exploring. I mean, I think as artists we're always learning and we're always discovering, and this was one of the ways that I did it. So there's, you know, there's a lot of colours in the Daniel Smith range, so there's a lot of pages here. I don't know if you want me to keep going, but it's you get an idea of the sorts of things that are possible, and this was where I just really explored every colour and what they did, and how they moved and what they were made with, and which I liked and which I wanted. And I've got a lot of them, but the ones I use are just really good friends. They become your buddies that you. This one's extraordinary for those who are not familiar. I don't normally use a black pigment, but Lunar Black is just so amazing that I do actually use that one quite a lot.
Oh, I agree. That's beautiful.
And there's the Lunar Earth that you were talking about.
Yeah, you can see as it dried, all that just terrific texture
and the
there.
Lunar Red Rock, which a bit like Indian red, is just amazing granulation.
You're getting people wishing you had published this book, Jane.
Look, I've thought about how to do it, but it's all handwritten and no one can read my writing apparently. So it would be a huge job to put it together. But it's something that's sort of on the back burner.
Yeah, you've had the patience and neatness in exploring those in a way that few people have. It's really, really marvelous. I'll just show a little example. This is a small one I made with the Daniel Smith Essential Set. And what I did here with it was, essentially it's like a multiplication table. So here's Hansi Yellow Light times New Gamboge, Purell Scarlet, Quinacridone Rose, French Ultramarine, and Phthalo Blue Green shade. And then you get the same down this way. But I mixed it on this half, the upper half. I tried to keep my mixes as clean as possible. And then in the lower half, I played with letting them intermingle more on the paper.
Nice.
And that taught me some as well of just, you know, what's going to be happening with the colors together and the range of greens and how to mix a near black with that scarlet and phthalo. And, you know, I personally feel, as I've already mentioned, you know, I gravitate towards being a little messy in my studio. But these things are worth doing at least once if you have some new colors, I feel, just to explore them and learn what happens if I mix 1 + 2. And I love the triads as well, because at least as an artist, I remind myself my rule of thumb is not to mix more than 3 colors together. Otherwise, it starts to get muddy. So just to have an idea of, you know, here's my starting point. Oh, if I can mix a nice orange, like you mentioned at the beginning, Jane, an orange plus a blue can give some terrific browns. So I think that is just such a terrific starting point for anyone. And then as an artist too, following kind of your books, when I'm exploring large paintings, if I'm playing with my mixes, I'll just paint swatches and make notes of what my swatches are to
Oh,
see,
lovely.
you know, and here's one I stuck some birds on.
Oh, that's
And
really
this one's
nice.
got a lot of granulation in it. And it teaches me so much just kind of doing one after another.
Well, it also gives you that practice of doing the big areas of colour, which a lot of people are scared to do once they're out, you know, actually working on the paper. So it's
Absolutely.
yeah, really nice.
Yeah, yeah. And makes me think, you know, as artists, or especially people, my students and people starting out, the blank page can feel really intimidating. And
Mm.
so giving yourself permission to just pull up some paper and mess around and just say, hey, can you just fill a paper where just explore painting, you know, the colors you see, maybe looking out your window and trying to see where you might mix some olive greens or, oh, and here I am using rosemary brushes, which you introduced me to.
They're great, aren't they?
But it's like that activation. Once you start painting, it's easier to keep painting, and then keep your experiments and use the other side, because
Yes.
use every bit of your paper as you can.
Well, I have pages. I mean, I've got books and books. I'll show you. Um, these are all books full of explorations of various kinds. There's more over there. So, you know, and I do keep them, and I try and annotate them, and I try and make use of them. And then there's more over here. So, you know, so many books of explorations, because it takes time and it takes work, I think, to understand what you're doing. And then I think, you know, as a teacher, I then try and share that so that everyone doesn't have to do it all. But I think it's actually really helpful to do some, because then you do your own experimenting and find your own favourites.
That's
So I think,
right.
you know, we can help people along the path, maybe save some time. But I think in the end that, you know, you have to do some of your own exploration as well and figure out what gives you joy. I know what gives me joy, and it's interesting when I come across people who say, "Oh, but I don't like granulating. What's that horrible mess?" And I think, "Oh, really? Well, you're missing out on half the fun." But it's personal, and that's the thing. And so then I would say to those people, "Okay, well then you should use, you know, Indanthrone blue and phthalo blue, and they won't granulate, but you're missing out on some of the fun stuff of a sodalite genuine or a green apatite genuine and the other things that they do." But for some people, that just looks like a mistake. So yeah, it's a fascinating process, figuring out what it is that you personally like and then working with that. But I think that we can do a lot to help people find their new best friends.
Absolutely. Yeah, going through that practice is huge. And yeah, I certainly find that in my palettes, I have sort of my I mean, I have a lot of palettes. That's one of my confessions that I carry around. But
Oh,
there are
really? So
chances
do I.
they're so small. But it's a chance to get to play and saying, hey, you know, here's one where I've got, you know, maybe greens to play. Oh, look at you. Oh, and Jane, that is such a cute demi you filled up.
I'll bring them over and show you in the light.
And we offered your ultimate mixing palette last year. Maybe we'll have to do a variation this year. Oh, those look so terrific. And you've got a green in your little one.
Yeah, so this guy, I'll take you over and show you these ones. So that's this guy. So I put that up on Instagram the other day. So it has Hansa Yellow Medium, Quinacridone Gold. So there's a sort of the kind of mid and warm yellow. It has Quinacridone Rose and Indian Red, which I love. Then it has Ultramarine and Cerulean. And then it has Perylene Green and Sap Green. So 2 convenience greens.
Oh, those
and
are
then along the bottom, it's got the goethite and, of course, burnt sienna. And, of course, buff titanium and Jane's Grey. So some of these ones I just, you know, always have. So it's if I go down to, I had a bit of a struggle with this one, I thought, because I love raw umber as well. But I think, you know, if I had to only use 12 colours, this is a pretty nice way to go. Indian Red's an interesting one because I do a lot of urban sketching, and so it's really good for tiles and so on, but it's also part of this wonderful triad. So the goethite, the Indian Red, the cerulean, or Hansa Yellow Medium, Quinacridone Rose and Ultramarine, or Quinacridone Gold, Quinacridone Rose, and Ultramarine are all fabulous. But in fact, so is this. This is a really nice triad to explore as well. And then chuck this one in. So it gives you so many options having just these 12 colours.
Oh,
And I
those
love
are
the Cerulean
terrific.
Green because
Mm-hmm.
without any phthalos, you know, the Cerulean Green gives you the ability to make some faster greens, and having the sap green obviously just makes it a bit easier, and I can make the undersea green mix with these two very easily.
Let's
So I
see.
find this to be, if I'm going to just use 12, this is workable, and this is just so cute. I mean, look how small they are. For those who haven't seen them, I mean, when I first saw this, I've always loved little things, but this is just such a little honey.
Oh, I gotta fill in with your colors, Jane. That's such a nice mix. I'm just showing what Perylene looks like. This is one of my favorite colors as well because it mixes to a near black, and
Yes.
and then with just a touch of like quinacridone gold or burnt orange, you start to really get some of those kind of evergreen, natural greens.
Yes,
Um,
but on its own, I mean, it's a black pigment, so it's an unusual one, but it's on its own, it's that really useful as shadow in foliage. I find it an invaluable colour.
yeah,
But once you add it to your palette, you wonder how to manage without it.
and then
But for
sap
those who
green.
don't,
Mhm.
sorry, for those who don't have it, you can make that hue by mixing phthalo green with pyrrole crimson or permanent alizarin crimson. That will create a perylene green hue. So if you don't have that colour, just put more of the phthalo green and you'll create a perylene green, which can be really helpful if you don't have to have all these colours to be able to create some of them.
Let's see, I don't quite have that right crimson on hand right here. Yeah, and that sap green too is a mix. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jane. Is it quinacridone gold and phthalo
And
blue?
phthalo green.
Phthalo
Phthalo
green.
green. Yes.
Um,
So
so
it's a mix. And because this palette doesn't have phthalo green in it, I thought it was a useful one to have. Whereas undersea green, I can make with these two.
so here's kind of mixing a sap.
And then you can modulate the sap green by adding a bit of burnt sienna if you want it to be more of an olive green. And if you want it to be more of a pine green, you can use a bit of Indian red. So they all just work together so nicely.
Let's see, I think that's my Indian red is sort of my deep scarlet. I'll have to pull out
Yeah,
Indian red
that'll
again.
work.
Yeah. um,
Indian red's tricky. It's one of the most opaque watercolors in the whole of the Daniel Smith range. There are very few colors that are completely opaque, but Indian red can be. I never use it completely opaque. I always water it down. So I'll usually use it much more diluted. And if you really dilute it, it's like a potters pink. It's just a very soft, dusty earth rose color. And if you dilute it a little bit, it's still very usable. So while it is a very opaque color, full strength, it's it don't have to use it full strength. And as I say, I very rarely do.
Jane, I saw a question from someone just about how you like to use buff titanium, because I agree it's just a terrific color. And actually, I'm laughing because I was on the beach sketching, and so my palettes have sand, and sand is one of my use cases for buff titanium. But would you mind sharing some of how you like to use buff titanium?
Oh, I use it in everything. So if you mix up buff titanium goethite and put it onto damp paper, you create a beach. I mean, particularly an Australian beach, just in one wash. And if you want to add some footprints, you just do a couple of Jane's Grey blobs, and that'll create footprints in the sand. So pre-mix it is actually quite good. If you pre-mix the two colours and put it onto damp paper, they'll granulate beautifully and create the idea of sand. And you can modulate it with more or less of the goethite, depending on how much you want to add of, whether it's a sort of more yellow or more white. We have some beaches in Australia that almost don't need any goethite at all. I use it for marble. So if I wanted to do a marble effect, I'll usually use the buff titanium and a little bit of Jane's Grey to do the fine little, the fine lines that you get in the marble. If you wait till it's just starting to dry and come in with a very, very fine brush, you get those feathery lines of marble. I use it for some of the Australian native plants, for botanicals, to make the very soft, very, very light greens. I use it sometimes in skin tones. If you use burnt sienna on its own, it will give a lovely skin tone. If you add a bit of buff titanium, it just gives a little bit more opacity. I use it in so many things. I just don't like to be without it. Coral coral, it's lovely. I mean, I've got sketches of all of these, but I can't necessarily pull them out immediately.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes I like to mix it with like a little bit of phthalo green or phthalo blue. Like if I want to just
Yes, so you can
kind of
make a
tone
cobalt.
down, here it is mixed with the green. And if I don't
Yes.
have a cobalt teal blue on me, it'll give me a little bit more of that like opaque, you know, more teal. That's mixed with the
And the
green, the phthalo
granulation.
green.
Yes.
And, you know, similar if I mix it with the phthalo blue, you know, if you imagine the sky closer to the horizon, there we go, kind of mixing on the fly, you get a little bit more of that. That's one of my uses of it.
Yes. No, I just find it wonderful. I get through so much of that. And if I'm topping up my students' palettes, because I make up palettes for them, the ones I'm topping up all the time are Buff Titanium and James Gray, the dark and the light. But it is interesting because, you know, so much of watercolor we think of as, oh, you mustn't use white. And I know it is a white paint. I think of it as an unbleached white, but I don't use it as a white. I use it as all sorts of other things.
Yeah, I actually do carry gouache basically in every palette for a similar reason. I enjoy sometimes just making a color a little bit more opaque, or being able to touch up just a little bit of white at the end, whether a bit of an iceberg or a bird or whiskers on a cat or power lines or a sailboat. You know, it's a really handy color and convenient. I've never actually worked personally with any other gouache. A lot of artists, I maybe sometime I'll play with it, but and Jane, I saw one other question too that I know some people wonder about, which is ultramarine versus French ultramarine. And I think I've got them here, if I remember my palettes correctly. And
the difference is 2 microns. So the one of them is ground a tiny bit finer, and so it just reflects the light slightly differently. And so the French ultramarine is a ever so little bit warmer because it's reflecting a little bit more red light, and the ultramarine is ever so slightly cooler because it's reflecting a little bit less of the red light. So the difference is 2 microns, and also ultramarine is series 1 and French ultramarine is series 2. So I've tended to just use ultramarine. It works perfectly with the burnt sienna mix. So that's what I've tended to use. But if you have either of them, they both mix in a very, very similar manner. But that's the difference, 2 microns.
2 microns, that's great to hear. Yeah, I've tended to use them interchangeably. I've noticed just that tiny shift in warm. And in the Essentials palette, Daniel Smith, that is with the French ultramarine. But sometimes just for the reason you stated, the series 1 versus series 2 using ultramarine, and they're just so similar that sometimes I forget which is which in my various palettes.
Yes, yes.
And both are just an extremely convenient, I think, all around great color to have in your palette.
Yeah, well, as I say, I don't think I've ever set up one without it.
You introduced me as well, Jane, and I only have an example of, I think, one in here, which is the Cerulean Blue versus Cerulean Blue Chromium. And you've turned me on to Cerulean Blue Chromium.
Yes, so Cerulean Blue is PB35, and Cerulean Blue Chromium is PB36, and it's richer and cooler, and I just find it much more useful and also more different from ultramarine. So I always use the Cerulean Blue Chromium. It's the same pigments that's used in the cobalt turquoise, not cobalt teal, but cobalt turquoise, PB36, but this is in the blue version, and it's a beautiful color. And I find that I use it mostly in skies, so wherever in the world I happen to be, I can usually, if there's a blue sky, it'll be ultramarine and cerulean in some proportion, with or without water and with or without grey, James Gray. Yeah. So that combination is really useful. But they're both similar in their characteristics. They both granulate, they're both liftable, they both have a little degree of opacity. So, you know, whichever one you happen to have, you can use. But my preference is always the chromium.
Yeah, I've gone exclusively to chromium as well. It's one of my staples for my mixing. In I just love mixing cool blues out of it. As I mentioned, one of my triads or kind of ranges is that Cerulean Blue Chromium with a little like deep scarlet and then Indian Throne Blue. Sometimes pulling in a little sienna, and I sort of make a little mix of them all together. That turns into,
and let them play on the page.
Yeah, that I love how they sort of settle into the page, and it's a really nice, cool Cool mix. And oh, then there's so much further. I mean, I love blues, for going from manganese or cobalt teal, and I think majority of my palettes are just blues and browns. I'm not as familiar with sort of the floral reds and pinks as some people, and I'll have to dive into that some more sometime.
Well, you can find them all on my website.
Yeah. And speaking of which, I see some people talking about it too. You have been offering, you've just launched a brand new online class.
Yes. So last Wednesday, I put out the introductory lesson. And then Wednesday, a couple of days ago, well, 3 days ago for me, was the first lesson. So it's a 12-week online course. It's the same course I've been running as an email course by PDF for a lot of years now. So I've had hundreds of students do it, but I've finally put together the videos and put it online, and it's on the Rizuku platform, which is a very user-friendly platform. And it'll just be a new lesson coming out every week for 3 months. I think the last lesson comes out on the 1st of July, and anyone can join in. They'll immediately get the introductory lesson and the first lesson available, and then they'll just get the others as they go. But it's really nice. The platform enables a bit of communication. So I've set up various gallery spaces so people can talk to each other, post up the samples of what they've done and ask questions and so on. So I'm interacting with everyone, and adding more content, or adding, there's a Q&A section at the end of each lesson. So if anyone asks a question, I can add more information about that. So it's a lovely group so far, and I'm really enjoying finally working through with videos, because it's been something I've been wanting to do for a long time. I haven't tried to be too technical. I'm doing it all myself. So, and I hate being on camera. So whenever I'm on the screen, I'm having to look at off screen, and it's really quite weird. But most of it is just showing my hands. But it means that it's just like looking over my shoulder and seeing exactly what I'm doing. So all the people who'd done the PDF, I've asked them if I've just joined them up for free because they'd already paid. And then anyone else who wants to do it can join in as well. So you can join any time up until the end. But obviously the sooner the better, because then you have that interaction and that sense of there's a new lesson coming each week. Once it's complete, I'll redo it as an on-demand course, and people can work through it exactly in their own time. But at least, and I have to look into this bit, because a few people have asked how long they have access. And I've sort of thought, well, they'll have at least a year, and then I just have to figure out with the Rizuku, how all that works, whether it's there forever or whether it's only as long as I'm paying for the fees. I don't quite know how that part works, but I figure, well, I'm going to be using the platform for quite some time and other courses. So I expect it to be available for quite a long time. But anyway, the fun part is actually working through with this wonderful group from all over the world. There's a couple of hundred students on board so far, and it's a really lovely group so far. So anyway, so that's it. And it's called Mastering Watercolors, and it goes through 5 different triads with suggestions of others, lots of colour mixing, but then lots and lots of different techniques for watercolour. And it's designed to be suitable for beginners, but serious beginners, people who just really want to know really how watercolour works, not just sort of a little bit of a play. And also people who've done some experience. A lot of them haven't covered the kind of material that we're doing. So it's a detailed, thorough introduction is how I'd call it, on how to master watercolors, how to understand them.
Oh, that's so fabulous. Yeah. So everybody, now's the time to go sign up for that if you want to be able to continue for the next few months with Jane. And what a cool opportunity. And I have been inspired too. I'm diving in with some of my first online classes. My first one tomorrow is filled on atmospheric landscapes. But if you sign up for my website on arttoolkit.com, my mailing list, you'll be able to be the first to hear about both my workshops and our various little products, such as the pocket palettes, art toolkits, and custom color editions. And Jane, we might have to talk down the road to do another collaboration together, because it's just so much fun to work with you. And for everyone who's watching this, we'll have this online in my stories. It'll be, the recording will be up for 24 hours, and then I can post a recording to YouTube as well. So if you'd like to rewatch it or have any questions, and I'll try my best in the description to do a little follow-up post to recap a little bit. But Jane, thank you for coming to join us all the way from Australia, and real pleasure to explore color with you. And thank you everybody who joined us. And message or leave some comments with any questions.
Nice to talk to you, Maria.
Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.